Okay, welcome everybody to the session on trade shocks and reshoring. My name is Johannes Binder. I work here at the Kiel Institute in Berlin. And the rules are, as in all sessions, we have 20 minutes presentation, 10 minutes discussion, and then 10 minutes Q&A. And we will start with Hamid Firooz. I hope I pronounce this more or less correct.
Yeah, Hamid Firooz, yeah.
Yeah, great. Yeah, the floor is yours. You have 20 minutes.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks to the organizers for putting our paper on the program. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you, the audience, for sticking around toward the end of the conference. So I'm going to talk about the reshoring, automation, and labor market under trade uncertainty. This is a joint work with Sylvain, Leduc, and Zheng, both at San Francisco Fed, so the usual disclaimer applies. So what we have seen in the United States is that reshoring has been rising in the past decade. Throughout the paper, by reshoring, we mean the fall in the share of imported intermediate goods. So here in this plot, we are looking at the share of imported intermediate goods in value added in the United States. And we see that this has been declining from like 10, 11% down to 6% over the past decade. So in the paper, we interpret imported intermediate goods as offshoring because these are the goods that could have been produced at home in principle, but are now being offshored. So the decline in the share of imported intermediate goods in the paper is interpreted as reshoring. So what we know from a growing body of the literature is that reshoring is easier when automation technology is available. We learned that from Dalia's paper, for example, yesterday, and quite growing literature on that. At the same time, we know that the presence of automation technology may reduce the benefits of this reshoring to workers. So what we see in the United States is that automation has been rising steadily over the past 2 decades. Throughout the paper, by automation, we mean specifically robotics because of the data availability. So here we are plotting robot density in the United States, being measured as the stock of industrial robots per 1,000 workers. So it has been rising from like 2 robots per 1,000 workers up to like 20, 25 robots per 1,000 workers. So in this paper, we try to understand if reshoring can reverse the effects of the so-called China shock by bringing jobs back and increase the wage of low-skilled workers. So we want to argue in this paper that the rise of automation technology makes the effects of reshoring more complicated. Because first of all, this threat of automation weakens the worker bargaining power when they bargain with the firm, because automation works as an outside option for firms. So this puts downward pressure on the wage increases. This downward pressure on the wage increases makes reshoring more possible when automation technology is available, because now firms don't have to offshore to reduce the cost of production. They can just produce it at home with lower cost of production. In the paper, we show that reshoring may or may not actually reduce employment in the United States. And we show that actually in our baseline calibration, we show that the reshoring induced by trade uncertainty may actually reduce employment in the United States. So reshoring may not bring jobs back. That's the main message. So we show in the paper that it depends on the calibration, depending on, for example, the persistence of uncertainty and also the response of automation to this reshoring. So we argue in the paper that to understand the labor market consequences of this reshoring, we need a general equilibrium model to understand this 3-way interaction between reshoring, automation, and labor markets. So we construct a general equilibrium framework in this paper featuring automation, labor market frictions, trade frictions, and skill heterogeneity. Firms produce final goods. Final goods can be produced using either domestically produced intermediate goods or import intermediate goods, like offshoring. In this paper, we focus on the reshoring induced by trade policy uncertainty. trade policy uncertainty, we model it as a stochastic volatility in trade cost. We focus on trade uncertainty particularly because of the surge in trade uncertainty in the past few years. So here we are borrowing the trade policy uncertainty index in the United States, borrowed from Caldara and co-authors JME paper in 2020. So this figure clearly shows that like after 2015, 2016, all these discussions about tariffs being increased, although they have not been implemented yet, that increases the uncertainty about trade. So we focus on trade policy uncertainty. The main mechanism of the model is that trade uncertainty can affect automation through 3 channels. One is that by trade uncertainty is going to induce reshoring. This expenditure switching is going to increase the investment in robotics. So this is going to increase automation. The second channel is precautionary saving. In a more uncertain environment, saving is higher, real rates are lower, so this induces more automation. The third channel which works against is the option value channel. In a more uncertain world, firms may wait, so this reduces the investment, the automation investment. We show that under our calibration, trade uncertainty leads to less imports. This is reshoring, more automation. We show that the investment in automation goes up in the face of trade uncertainty. We also show that this trade policy uncertainty increases labor productivity, increases skill premium, and actually this reshoring induced by trade uncertainty is going to reduce low-skilled employment. So reshoring is not going to bring jobs back. So these are theoretical predictions, and we show that these theoretical predictions are quite in line with what the data suggests in the United States. So I'm going to provide some industry-level evidence supporting the model implications. So we contribute to a very rapidly growing body of the literature on reshoring. The first strand is on automation and trade, how automation affects trade. The last strand is on uncertainty or trade policy uncertainty in particular. And our contribution is to develop a general equilibrium framework to understand the 3-way interaction between reshoring, automation, and labor markets. So I'm going to talk about the model briefly on calibration. I'm going to show you some impulse response functions and then supporting the model mechanisms using some data. So it's going to be an open economy DMP model, search and matching model with automation. Final goods are produced using either domestically produced intermediate goods, YD, or import intermediate goods, YF, with some delivery lag on the imports, and with some elasticity of substitution between the two governing the trade elasticity theta. Domestic goods can use, domestic intermediate goods can use either a labor-only technology, YN, or an automation technology YA, with some elasticity of substitution between the two technologies, sigma. These domestically produced intermediate goods can be used in the domestic production, YD, or can be exported, X. So both exports and imports are subject to iceberg trade costs, and we model trade uncertainty as stochastic volatility in this iceberg cost tau. This labor-only technology, YN, is produced using labor-only, subject to random search friction, and YA, the automation technology, can produce goods using skilled workers and robots. And all goods markets are perfectly competitive. To create a vacancy, firms have to pay a cost drawn from a distribution F. The value, denote the value of a vacancy by JV. So firms post a vacancy if and only if the value of a vacancy exceeds the cost of the vacancy. Then the vacancies and unemployed individuals randomly match in this unskilled workers randomly match in this frictional labor market. Now firms have a choice to whether to automate their position or not. To automate, they have to pay a sunk cost of adopting the automation technology new. denote the value of the automation, automation by JA. This is a flow profit of automation plus expected discounted value, denoting the net benefits of automation by the value of automation, JA, net of the value of a vacant position, JV. This denoted by V star, nu star. So a firm decides to automate a position if and only if the draw of the sunk cost of automation is lower than the net benefit. Now, like the unemployed individuals and vacancies are matched, and then they bargain over the surplus to determine the wage. It's a standard Nash bargaining game. So SH is the surplus to the household of this from this match, and JE is the value of employment at the firm. So the surplus for the firm is JE, net of the value of a vacant position, JV. So from this bargaining, it turns out that the steady state wage is increasing in the unemployment insurance benefit fee. It's increasing in this utility from working. This is chi. It's increasing the workers' bargaining power B. These are all expected and standard. What is new in this automation, in this environment, is that the wage is decreasing in the value of a vacant position, JV. And this value of a vacant position, JV, is increasing when the automation technology is available. In other words, the threat of automation is going to increase the value of a vacant position because this firm can use the automation technology later on. So this threat of automation is going to push a downward pressure on wages. So we look at the search equilibrium with markets clearing, and in the baseline, we look at financial autarky with balanced trade. But we show that in the paper, we show that all results are robust when we open the capital accounts. So to calibrate, we basically match the steady state observations in the US labor market following the paper that my co-authors have now published at AJ Macro. I should change it to 2024, I believe. We also externally calibrate some trade-related parameters. One is the short-run trade elasticity. We calibrated to 0.8. This is in line with Boehm and co-authors' AER paper, and also with Shebnem's calibration that, for example, she showed us yesterday. We calibrate the mean of the iceberg cost from the literature to Anderson Van Winkoob, and we also calibrate the first and second moment shocks to trade costs from Caldara and co-authors' JME paper. For the automation-related parameters, we calibrated using our strategy that we did in a previous work with Zhang Liu and Yajie Wang. So importantly, one key parameter in the model is the elasticity of substitution between labor-only technology and automation technologies governed by sigma. So in the other paper, we calibrated to kind of match the observation in the US that over the past 15 years, the robot density in the United States has increased by 300%, while the relative price of robots has declined by 40%. So we come up with elasticity of around 2. And I should emphasize that this elasticity is relatively conservative relative to other studies in the literature. So other estimates in the literature are more around 3, 4. So our results are, I should say, are even conservative. And also, like another important parameter is the share of automation technology that we kind of calibrated to the US to match the robot density in the United States in 2016, which is 2%. So now I'm going to show you some impulse response functions to show the macroeconomic effects of trade policy uncertainty. So these are one standard deviation shocks, the effects of one standard deviation shocks to trade policy, to trade uncertainty. So we show that these panels show that, first of all, we have reshoring in response to this trade policy uncertainty, as we expect. Imports fall. We have precautionary saving and real interest rates fall. As a result of both expenditure switching and precautionary saving, robot density goes up. Firms invest more in the automation technology. And because the automation technology and the labor-only technology are substitutable, we show that unemployment for the lowest skilled workers go up. Employment for these guys go down. So this is this in the sense that reshoring is actually reducing. Reshoring induced by trade policy uncertainty is actually reducing employment for lowest skilled workers. So labor productivity goes up because of this investment in automation. As a result, output and consumption both go up. The skill premium also go up because in the model, robots and skilled workers are complements. The investment in automation technology is gonna increase the wage of the high skilled workers and increase the skill premium as a result. We show that the response of automation amplifies the effects of the trade uncertainty. Here we are looking at the counterfactual inside the model in which, so the blue lines are the baseline results that I just showed you. The red dashed lines are the results in a counterfactual model in which we shut down the response of automation to this trade policy uncertainty. We fix the probability of automation to the initial steady state of the model. So we show that if the automation does not respond to trade policy uncertainty, we see that all the effects are quite different. Specifically all the results are much less strong. Specifically looking at the response of unemployment, this is the reversal of the China shock narrative, if you want. In the absence of the endogenous response to automation, we see that, yes, this reshoring induced by trade policy uncertainty actually does bring jobs back to the US. But if the automation responds, as in our baseline, we expect to see that robot density goes up a lot and also unemployment goes up. We also show that the results are stronger when the economy is initially more open to international trade. The results are stronger in this counterfactual if we have less home bias. I don't have time to go through the higher persistence of trade policy uncertainty, but if trade policy uncertainty are more persistent, then the effects are stronger, if everybody believes that trade policy uncertainty is here to stay. Now we want to support, these are the model predictions, so we want to show if we find some supporting evidence in the data. So these are the testable implications of the model. Main implications is that trade uncertainty reduces imports, reshoring, and stimulates automation. We expect to see that even in this uncertain environment induced by trade uncertainty, we expect to see increase in automation investment. Other predictions are that trade uncertainty increases labor productivity, increases value added, and increases the skill premium, but reduces the employment of lowest skilled workers. And we want to show that these macro effects work through the automation channel. So these are the implications that we test. These are the data sources that we use. The Trade Policy Uncertainty Index, again, from Calder and co-authors' JME paper. Robot density from the International Federation of Robotics. Offshoring measured by imported intermediate goods using OECD trade in value added. We construct a skill premium using CPS and industry-level tariffs to control for the first moment shocks using the WITS data. So this is the main empirical specification that we run. On the left-hand side, we have either the share of imported intermediate goods at industry J at time T, or robot density at industry J at time T, either of the two on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, if you want, we have a shift share interaction between the initial exposure of different industries to offshoring, measured by, proxied by the share of imported intermediate goods in the beginning of the sample at industry J, interacted by trade policy uncertainty in the US at time T. And we also control for the first moment effect coming from the change in tariffs at the industry level over time. So these are the first main implications of the model that are tested in the data. We see that, yes, trade policy uncertainty increases robot density in the US in the industries that are more exposed to to offshoring. The second column shows that this trade policy uncertainty is going to induce reshoring. And then we look at labor productivity. We see that labor productivity increases in response to trade policy uncertainty, as the model implies, and this is coming from the investment in automation. We see that skill premium also goes up in response to trade policy uncertainty, again, coming from the automation technology. We don't have a statistical power to see that, to precisely estimate the effects of, for example, employment, but still the point estimate is negative, as the model implies. But admittedly, we have quite limited number of observations and not statistical power. And we show that all these effects are actually working through automation technology in the following sense. We run a two-stage approach. In the first stage, we project robot density on trade policy uncertainty, interacted by initial share of import intermediate goods. And then we use the predicted robot density in the second stage to kind of show the channeling of automation on these macroeconomic variables. And we show that because of this automation, labor productivity goes up, skill premium goes up, and employment falls. To wrap up, in this paper, we study the three-way interaction between reshoring, automation, and labor markets in response to trade policy uncertainty. The model implications are that trade policy uncertainty is going to induce reshoring, but it's not going to bring jobs back. Our baseline calibration shows that, if anything, this reshoring is going to actually reduce employment. This reshoring induced by trade policy uncertainty also is going to increase labor productivity and a skill premium, and these predictions are in line with the industry-level evidence from the United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will now have the discussion by Florian Unger.
All right, thank you very much for having me as a discussant, for inviting me of this very interesting paper. So it was really enjoying it to read it and also to think about the implications. So in a nutshell, you have presented it quite clearly. You have a very competent analysis of a small open economy model which features search and matching frictions with fixed costs of vacancy creation. There's skill heterogeneity, which is important for the labor market implications. So firms decide endogenously, facing a draw of specific sunk costs, to automate or not, and then use high-skilled or low-skilled labor in the production process. And they decide also on importing intermediate inputs, and there we have uncertainty of trade costs. So it's not only about the size, it's really about this uncertainty mechanism. In line with suggestive evidence that you briefly could summarize, and this is the second part of the paper, you show that, and you focus on this trade uncertainty shock, it increases robot density and decreases imports. So that is the, you could say, reshoring part of the paper. Then due to this labor market friction, raises unemployment and the skill premium, and we have, while having overall effects that are positive on productivity and value added. So I was coming up with a key question to assess the contribution of the paper, which is clearly written, and you have a very nice analysis also with respect to counterfactuals. So after calibrating the model, you really show the different channels and how they contribute to this relationship of trade uncertainty, automation, and reshoring, where you contribute to this literature. I think the key question is, how important is this trade uncertainty shock to explain exactly this linkage between reshoring, coming back from intermediate inputs that are now more produced in the home country, around adoption, rising wage inequality. So I would like just highlight two of your counterfactuals that are, I think, quite important, and you stress this effects of trade uncertainty, of this shock increase with higher openness of a country, that is the trade channel, and also with endogenous or varying automation probability, comparing this to a benchmark where you fix the automation probability to the initial steady state level. That is, I think, very illustrative for showing how important this automation channel is. To think about this key question, how important is the contribution, I try to summarize the main effects in this table. So you see this trade uncertainty shock raises robot density, employment goes down, value added and productivity react positively. The first observation you can draw from this table is that is very similar to a decrease in the robot price, for example, analyzed in the paper of Artuk in the JIE last year. And actually, you used some of the variation in the calibration to come up with this elasticity of substitution. They used the decrease in the robot price, so that could be an alternative story. So that is the first observation, and my comments are exactly based on this table. The second observation is you have a particular labor market friction. That is this labor earnings channel where the skill premium goes up, where in a standard framework you would have just a depressing in wages because employment goes down. And the import channel is also quite distinct, and I will exactly focus on these main comments. So what is about the import channel, this role of the labor market friction, and then also the comparison to this decrease in the robot price. So the first suggestion is that the relevance of this import channel is quite important. So in your baseline specification, we have that importing intermediates and robot adoption are substitutes in a small open economy framework. If you go to this Artuk paper, there is an ambiguous effect because having higher productivity after automation in the north can raise demand for southern inputs. And we elaborate on this in a recent working paper showing that it depends on the position in the global supply chain. So whenever there's automation in the north, it could happen that you benefit if you have complementary inputs that are then sold from the south. So I think you could elaborate a little bit on this relevance of the input channel and position this clearly in the literature as these robot-induced shifts of international specialization could be driven by supply, by substitution and complementary effects. The technical insights here are that you focus on a CS production function. You have then an extension in the recent version allowing a little bit for a complementary input to robot adoption. In this Artuk paper, it is based on a task-based approach in a Ricardian model of trade with a continuum of inputs. So there you get these ambiguous effects, and we refine this a little bit by looking at within industry and between industry inputs that could be affected differently. So that could be interesting to address. My second comment is on this role of the labor market imperfection. We were already talking a little bit about this before the session. So also the welfare implications are of course quite interesting. So you have the wage of skilled workers determined based on so-called unconstrained optimization, and then search matching frictions appear for the unskilled workers. So you can interpret this automation choice in a sense as a trade-off. You pay additional sunk costs, benefit from higher automation specific productivity, but also circumvent the labor market friction that arises then for unskilled workers. So the crucial assumption is here really about the complementary and substitutability of these different worker types with respect to robotization. So this transmission channel could receive much more attention, especially how it drives your results on reshoring and the automation effects. The third part is more about the connection between the empirics and the theory, and might be maybe a more demanding part. So you talked to me and said we have follow-up projects maybe, so you can decide whether this is something for maybe other papers you aim to write. So I think that the connection could be much stronger to convince readers that this trade uncertainty channel is really important by either going beyond the supportive evidence, and you are quite clear in the paper that it's not your goal to have a causal identification, but at least address the endogeneity concerns that are apparent here, or you use your model simulations. That would be the other road for counterfactual analysis, actually, looking at exactly this difference that you have seen in the table, that the trade uncertainty shock could have very similar implications compared to robot price shock. So with respect to the first suggestion, I felt that there was a little bit of tension. So you have variation of openness at the country level in the theory, but you exploit then the input shares across sectors and the empirics. we know from the literature that there could be substantial differences in robot adoption across sectors, and that could drive uncontrolled dynamics in your robot measure, especially if you think of the story that there is an overall trend of reducing adoption costs, and now sectors vary due to technological differences in how they exploit that and how they can replace workers by robots. So one idea would be an instrument-to-variable approach to interact a global robot stock measure with the sector replaceability to show that this uncertainty shock has exponential power after controlling for robot shocks driven by these cost changes across sectors. If you don't want to go this route, maybe another suggestion is that you could use your model to also fix that and use this counterfactual analysis, contrast your implications of this trade uncertainty shock with the effects of a reduction in robot adoption that you exploit, at least in the calibration, to get the sigma. To which extent can cost reduction explain the magnitude of the simulated effects, or put differently, what would be the corresponding decrease in robot adoption to make it clearer to obtain the same magnitude of effects? So I think these are quite interesting questions to compare how important this trade uncertainty channel is for this reshoring story. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Florian. Hamid, you want to respond directly? And then we will collect some questions.
Yeah, I wanted to thank Florian for thoughtful discussion. Thank you so much. All points well taken, and we are working on the revision. So these are very helpful. As you said, some of them I see that as like we are working on some of those as like in follow-up papers. So some of the assumptions that we make is we make them because of because these are standards in the literature. For example, the complementarity between robots and skilled workers is something that the literature assumes quite often. So we are basically building on that without really providing any evidence on that. For the IV, the IV for the robots, definitely this is something that we can do. And actually in the other paper that I cited, we do use that. So this is something that we can definitely do to improve the empirics. For the quantification, this is exactly what we are doing in a follow-up paper, that we want to see like how much of, because we observe that reshoring is not very recent for the past like couple of years. It started in the United States after 2010, 2011. At the same time that robots are like the robot density is rising. So we are actually doing like this quantification to see how much that decline, the relative price of robots can explain the effects. But points well taken, and we are working on some of those. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. We are collecting questions from the audience.
Thanks. That's a great paper, and I completely buy the thesis, and I find the empirical results very interesting. But I'm a bit unsure why you're talking about robots specifically and not just about, you know, a more capital-intensive way of production. So if you have a tractor on a farm, it reduces the need for farm workers. If you have a conveyor belt in a car factory, it reduces the number of workers. So, you know, it seems to me that robots are not the only labor-saving technology. And it seems to me that everything that you talk about is actually simply about adopting more capital-intensive means of production and thus reducing the demand for labor. So if you could say I mean, apart from the fact that you've got good data on robots, but that's like, you know, looking for a coin under a street lamp because there happens to be a street lamp. Isn't this a more general thesis about capital-intensive modes of production?
Yeah, that's a very good comment, and this is like something that we receive quite often. That what is specific about this type of technology? Is this anything specific about robots? So there are two things that we think like robot is different. One is that this is not so much clear if like this general capital equipment is nowadays more complements even to low-skilled workers. If you think about, for example, some machines or some like computers or something. This is not super clear, like if this is like complements or substitutes. And the second is that we don't see that rapid increase in the, or that rapid decline in the relative price of, for example, these capital equipments. This is something that we think that this is like new in the sense that those technologies were present even after the China shock, but China shock induced like reduced the jobs and so on. So we want to see that now it seems that the scope of the technology is different from like 2000. And we think that most of the innovations and advancement were in kind of robotics in manufacturing. But I agree that we are actually like trying to run similar regressions for capital, general capital equipments to see if, for example, trade policy uncertainty, the same regression is actually increasing the capital, general capital equipment or not. But this is a valid concern to which extent robots are different from general capital equipment.
Okay, any more questions from the audience? I don't see any at the moment, so thanks very much again, Hamid. And then we will have the next presentation by Prashant Garg on supply shocks and onshoring.
Thank you, everyone. This is a joint work by Thiemo Fetzer, who is sitting in the room, and two PhD students from LSE, Peter Lambert and Bennet Feld. This is a labor of love, and for Thiemo, labor of long-term love. He's been working on this since 2017 or something, but back then, before pre-LLMs, there was little availability of structuring the vast corpus of knowledge graph that exists on production processes. Since then, we've seen lots of advancements, and we've seen lots of applications of LLMs, but there are some applications that help us find explicit data on something that is latent, which is a very granular production network. We are able to get production networks at industry level, like input-output table, which are relatively coarse. We want lots of very granular linkages at product level. One of the product level data sets is the HS harmonized system codes, which has 2-digit, which are around 100 industries. There are 4-digit that are around 1,200 industries, and 6-digit that are 5,000 industries. You can tell whether a product is a capital good, an intermediate good, a raw material. We are trying to build in this paper, using the knowledge graph of a large language model, a production network. And that production network will be used as a demonstration in the paper to study onshoring as a phenomenon. When is onshoring happening, where is it happening, and potentially on which products as well. So being so late in the program means you don't have to motivate your paper. A lot of people have already studied about this, especially even the last presenter has studied supply reshoring, localization, supply chain resiliency, all these issues. We have rising number of industrial policies, as you can see on the plot in the left, in yellow. We also see increasing number of mention of local content in news articles, which is in the blue line in the left plot. Things like made in America, made in India, those kind of populist languages. We also see increasing number of trade disputes raised in WTO on the right-hand side. These have been increasing. The other thing is then world trade as a percentage of world GDP, which had been increasing for a long time. We are now seeing a slowdown in that since around 2008. So this paper, as I said, we are trying to identify onshoring and how trade shocks are influencing onshoring. We are trying not to give very specific causes of why onshoring is happening. We want to keep it open for interpretation. It could be industrial policy, it could be trade disputes, resilience of supply chain, populism. There could be many reasons. We do not pinpoint which, but we try to show whether it's happening, when is it happening, and as a response of supply shocks in general, whatever the sources of supply shocks might be. So we already know we've been motivated in this conference. So I'll spend the first half of the presentation trying to describe this measurement challenge at a granular level. On the right, you see, on the bottom, on the most downstream, you see we have wind turbines. In the middle, you see processed steel. And on the top, you see the most raw material. You can think of the one on the top as being upstream and one being on the bottom as downstream. So generally, the data we get is an input-output table at the industry level, so that iron ore may be merged with some other kind of ores, that steel may be merged with some other kind of metals, and wind turbines would be merged with other sort of capital inputs that represent wind turbines, which means if we see a shock in one thing and we want to see how it propagates, it's very hard to see shock on something so aggregate, which it will average out, and we hardly would measure any shock, let alone its impact in the production network. So this is the measurement challenge. We want to identify upstream good. But another measurement challenge is we don't want to rely on market transactions, because if we are trying to understand onshoring and we rely on a production network based on market transaction, there will be huge endogeneity. So what we rely on is technical requirements to make, let's say, wind turbine. What do you need to make wind turbine? You need iron, you need some kind of machinery that cuts iron, and all sorts. I'm not an expert, but you need lots of things to make these things, regardless of whether there's a transaction happening in the market. Because it could be that the wind turbine provider is not transacting with others because the firm is vertically integrated, so there is no transaction. They are the ones mining, they are the ones processing, and they are the ones making. In that case, we never would observe any market transaction, so we cannot build an input-output table based on that. So we try to build this production network based on a knowledge graph. How do you make wind turbine? So let's go to something simpler, which is milk. So how do you make milk? How do you make full-fat milk? So if you ask ChatGPT, how do you make full-fat milk, you will get a response something like this. You need to milk the cow, filtration and cooling. You need to separate things, pasteurization. But this is not enough. How do you make a production network out of this? This is very unstructured data. You can get something like this on Wikipedia. We also want to know not just you need cows to make milk. We want to know capital equipment. It could be milking machines. It could be machines that help cow get the right temperature in the barn, wherever cow is made. You need to ask what are the raw materials needed. You need to feed soybean to cow. You need what are the most critical inputs. There are lots of things you can ask to build this production network, but you also need some kind of a structure to this. So our innovation is we try to create a prompt that gives this kind of structure. The data that is given to large language model, it's huge. There are billions of parameters. There are billions of documents. It knows all of Wikipedia and lots of production process documents. So if on Wikipedia itself, you would see there are multiple blue-colored links. Each link you click, there is another page, and there are many pages. So you can see mammary glands of mammals. Then mammals, how do you make mammals? Saturated fat is one downstream product of milk. Then that saturated fat, you can see uses of that saturated fat as well. So there is already a knowledge graph that is in the training set of large language models. Our goal is to extract that knowledge graph and create a production network. But we also want some kind of a structure that allows us to to then convert this to economic data, because currently it just says milk or full-fat milk, but we want some kind of a number, some kind of a product category, like we have industry classification. So we use HS codes. What we do is we convert products into HS codes. And I can show this in a flowchart. So the green things show the large language model. It has a training corpus. It has model weights. That's the innovation of a large language model provider. We make some parameter choices. We give a very long prompt, which we have refined over time to get the most structured output. We ask the same prompt multiple times because there are some concerns that a large language model may hallucinate. So we try to ask the same thing 20 times, and then we pick the kind of union. We have the option of picking the majority of the response we get. So these are some ways to extract something certain from something that is probabilistic, which is a response of a large language model. And then we get a set of vertically linked free text description of products. So you need cows to make milk. But now we want to convert that into HS products. So what we do is we go to this process which is called vector embeddings. What vector embeddings do is it converts a free text response into a set of vectors, which are, let's say, 1,000 length vector, which will represent meaning. It's a semantic description of text. We create semantic description of milk. We create semantic description of HS products, and then we see which ones are the most similar. And that similarity helps us give assign an HS code to a free text description. So we would get an HS code for full-fat milk. We would get it for skimmed milk, fully skimmed milk, all sorts of milk. And we have 5,000 such HS codes. So we get basically vertical connections, input-output connections between 5,000 products. Total number of connections could be 5,000 times 5,000, which is 25 million. But in the end, you don't need everything to make everything. So we would get something around 1 million or 3 million, something in that range. So it would be a matrix of 5,000 by 5,000, simply an input-output table. So now that we have this data product, which we aim to make available in 2 or so weeks when we try to release the paper, we have to validate this because we just created this out of nowhere. So let's first look at some examples. So this is full-fat milk in the middle in pink. There are lots of uses of full-fat milk, which are things that the full-fat milk is pointing towards. There are lots of inputs, like you need cattle, you need sheep. If you want to make milk from sheep, you need filtering machines, you need dairy machines. You can find such examples for insulin, printing press, artillery weapons, copper ores. So you can see there are key goods like insulin. There are key intermediary goods like printing press and capital equipment like artillery weapons and copper ore as well. So we have the inputs and the outputs, the potential uses. You can understand dual uses as well of a given good, like copper ore. If you look at the full network, you see something that is hard to understand, but we colored things according to their B, C, end use category. So green represents processed final goods, and blue represents capital goods. But if you convert this network into centralities to see what's very influential, what's the most influential product in the network, we can see blue represents high centrality and high complexity, basically, and red represents low centrality. And we can see the production process. So if you saw the green bits were the final processed goods, they are the ones with the highest centrality, and things that are more upstream, which you will see they're also positioned in that way. So things that are on the top and on the left are ones that are more upstream. But let's move to some validation. The closest thing we could compare it to is input-output tables. So you can take input-output tables from US or Mexico, On the y-axis, we have pairwise input expenditure. So industry I as an input to industry J, how much does it cost? And we have recast our production network from HS products, from 5,000 HS products to somewhere around 300 industries on the x-axis. So that represents our pairwise input linkages coming from our network. And we see a positive correlation both with the US input-output table and the Mexican input-output table, which gives us some confidence that it gives us some signal, both in developing and developed country examples. We also see how it compares with some measures in the literature, such as product complexity index. So we see goods that are of higher centrality in our production network also are goods that are more complex. And goods that are more complex, you see, have also lower upstreamness, which makes sense because downstream goods would more likely have higher complexity, although it gets a little nonlinear at the end. Because sometimes you get final goods that are low complexity, like horses. You may just ride a horse as a final good, or you may get iPhones, which are highly complex. We also look at what happens when we perturb our network. If we add noise to our network incrementally until the network is fully noise, we see that our correlations with these existing measures go down to 0, just as a way to do some kind of sense check that if we add noise, we lose all our signal. Okay, so some final thoughts on measurement. We get a discrete network, so you need milk to make cheese, but we don't know how much milk we need to make cheese. So currently, that's one limitation, whereas input-output tables, currently, even though they're coarse, they have weights attached to the network. This is something we are working on, and we will try to improve. The other thing is that the network is homogeneous, so perhaps production networks vary by country, and over time, you may need solar to make electricity or in some places, or you may need coal. So these things vary. We have potentially a full set of inputs that are relevant, but they may change, their weights may change, some may be substitute to each other. So this is some future work, but it has strengths, which is, it is very granular. It can be directly used with trade data because you can find trade data that is in HS code. Okay, so some descriptive results. So if we pick BC goods classification, so they have classifications for capital goods, consumption goods, and intermediary goods. And we do a regression of number of input edges to a product on whether it is a capital good. We see there's a positive correlation. So that suggests capital inputs have more input edges, so they need more input. And consumption goods need more input. Intermediaries, they have a negative correlation, so they have less input, whereas what they have is they have more output. So intermediary goods have multiple uses, and they have lots of uses, is what this is suggesting. We also see consumption goods have a negative correlation with output edges because by the definition, they're consumption goods, so you don't use it again. If we look if we take terciles of centrality of a good, we see that since 2016, goods that are more downstream have started diverging with goods that are more upstream in their trade value, which is one suggestion that either more complex goods are traded less and low complexity goods are traded more, or it could mean that upstream goods are traded more than downstream goods. And we can understand that because, as we saw earlier, that there was a negative correlation between upstreamness and authority centrality. Okay, so let's move to our cross-country regressions. So we see increasing number of persistent price shocks. These are structural breaks of prices at product level since 2016. We see the geographic distribution of these price shocks. A lot are happening in China. In Canada, we can kind of see the trade wars in this map. So what we do is we have a regression where the dependent variable is imports at product by country by time level. Then we regress this on supply shocks, which are either supply shocks on the upstream goods or supply shocks on the downstream goods. And we interact this with whether or not two goods are have a dyad or not, whether they are input or output. So basically what we see is that when there is a shock at the downstream level good, it reduces the import of that good, which is the minus 2.3, which makes sense. If there's a price shock to something, you will import less of that. That's the direct impact, and that's economic theory. And then what's interesting is that if there's a shock on, let's say, cheese, you will start importing milking machines, you will start importing raw materials such as soybean, you will start importing intermediary and capital goods like cows, so that you can make cheese yourself. This is what this regression is suggesting. And we can see this by country as well. We can see on the top, so on the x-axis is the direct price shock, and we would see most countries are on the left. That this is basically supply. If price increases, demand goes down. On the y-axis, we see the indirect thing, which was 1.4 on average, but here we see it broken down by country. And we see most countries are on the left, and on the top, that's where the mass is. So things on the top left quadrant show this is onshoring response, plus it is people who are elastic to price. Whereas on the right, where we also see US and Germany, even though they are onshoring because they are on the top, they are not, with increase in prices of goods, they're not reducing their imports. They're still continuing to import, which suggests they can either not substitute, but or they're having some problems, basically, in substitution. And we can see this in the map as well. We see onshoring countries in blue, and we see countries that are not onshoring in red. And we see China, we see US as countries that are particularly onshoring. Okay, so we have this case study where we add some causal evidence. So Qatar received a blockade in 2017, and we can show that blockade increased import prices. Suddenly, it reduced import volume suddenly. It acts as a perfect study for us to do a difference in difference. We have a similar specification, except it's just a country level. Country is importing. Country by product dyad by time level. And we see similar result again. In column number 3, you see the extensive margin where the direct effect is negative and the indirect effect is positive, with indirect effect being onshoring. And we can see this visually as well, both blue line being indirect onshoring and red line being the direct impact, both intensive and extensive margin. So to conclude, we build this AI-built production network that allows us to study vertical substitution up the value chain, and we hope to make this available across all HS nomenclatures, and we hope to improve and add weights to the network and localize it to different countries' contexts. And the results we show are there's a global trade pattern that shifts towards upstream goods, structural breaks in unit prices, so supply shocks correlate with vertical substitution, and we show an exogenous blockade event leads to onshoring via an upstream substitution. So that was an example of industrial transformation in Qatar, but it may not always be that big. So that's why we have the cross-country level analysis showing just overall if prices increase on downstream goods, what happens to upstream goods. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prashant. And now we will have a discussion by Friedrich Geiecke from LSE.
Yeah, okay, so I really enjoyed reading this paper. It studies, unsurprisingly, trends in onshoring, how countries shift import demand relative to changes in prices. So here, when I think the main innovation of this paper is to leverage this large language model to construct, as was already discussed in some detail, this what they term IPNet or production network. For this, they use more than 5,000 of these harmonized system product codes and relate them as inputs and outputs. Aided to this network, you can then measure how supply shocks affect the linked products. So I'll repeat the key findings again. I put them on one slide. So one is that a decrease in global imports of these downstream goods relative to upstream raw materials and intermediate goods and capital inputs happened. And that's linking, or that's signaling this onshoring that countries are increasingly producing these downstream goods themselves. So supply shocks, for example, shortages or geopolitical events can explain a substantial fraction of this onshoring process. Production tends to become more localized, and the strongest effect you can see for substitutions and production taken over by the country itself for capital good imports. And then last is this case study with a small open economy where they can derive some causal estimate that a 5 percentage point increase in the price of downstream products causes a 3 percentage point increase in relative imports of upstream goods that are linked to this good. Okay, so a few general comments. So overall, I think it's a very interesting idea to try to utilize the knowledge that is in the LLM to map out production processes and networks. Conceptually, the LLM is like a lossy compression of a lot of data that it has been trained on, and all of that knowledge relevant for this application here should be contained in it, like already discussed previously. So with this novel network, as was also discussed, is you could also study a lot of other topics. One thing I immediately thought about is certain bottleneck products and trade and production processes and so on. And I think the authors also want to make this available such that plenty of studies should be able to be done with that data. And one thing I was wondering when I read through the paper was if it would be possible to add a bit, some kind of additional back-of-the-envelope type calculations of the relative importance of these processes for things like aggregate welfare and so on. So next, I'm not a trade economist, but I work more with natural language processing, so I wanted to focus more on that side of the paper. And before I do this on a slide, I wanted to go once through this process of how they built this network from my understanding. And the first was you prompt a language model and ask it for a suggested product code from this HS list. What are inputs to this good and what is this good an input for? And then you get lists of suggested goods from the language model. You do this 20 times, you concatenate all these lists, and now you have some summed up list of possible inputs to that good and goods where that good is an input. Next, you need to, because these are just in free text, you need to determine what the HF codes of all these suggested goods are. And for this, you do cosine similarities, you embed them as vectors, you compute similarities between vectors of these descriptions of products and standardized descriptions of products, namely these HS codes, and you keep only the most similar ones. In the end, you have a list of possible products linked to a specific product, and you want to rule out some false positive links. So you want to get rid of some that actually wouldn't seem reasonable. And for this, with that much reduced list, they prompt another language model to check whether the final suggested links are actually are likely valid. Okay, so that's the general approach. You do this over all the product codes, and in the end, you have legitimately all the links between all the products. So For this to work, it seems that you need to write a fairly big prompt suggesting certain types of answers and adding a lot of information into the prompt. And two broad ways are to either add information to a prompt in terms of written text, you suggest things to the model, or to actually change the parameters of the underlying model. And one thing I've been wondering about is whether it could be possible to give actual output that is the desired output to the model and tune it on prompt answer pairs that you wrote yourselves. You could do that in addition to having the long prompt or in replacement of this. That would also, like, you don't need very large samples for this. If you wrote examples for maybe like 100 or so, then the empirical evidence I'm aware of suggests that that already shifts behavior a lot of these models. That could also make the requests a lot cheaper because you don't have to have that many inputs tokens in every request because now you've changed the parameters such that that is not necessary. Then I was wondering, there is this threshold in the paper of a cosine similarity of 0.75, and to see some additional sensitivity analysis to this. Because it's also immediately linked to another thing, namely this last step, which is there to detect false positives. So any suggested links that are actually do not seem reasonable. So then they leverage an additional language model to do this last step, and that model checks false positives. It removes links that wouldn't seem robust. However, there are also false negatives, links that haven't been suggested in the first place. Links haven't been suggested in the first place, they seem linked to the first two steps of the analysis. One, the LLM didn't suggest these links to begin with, or the cosine similarity threshold of 0.75 was too high to actually find these. And I'm wondering if you added the fine-tuning, if you haven't done that and explored that already, and some kind of lower cosine similarity thresholds, whether it could be possible to try to rule out some of the false negatives. I think in the limit also, when we're looking here at 5,000 product scores, so 25 million pairs, potential pairs, in the limit it might actually be possible also to ask LLMs about each pair. Right? So 25 million is not an infeasible amount of requests. Then we wouldn't need all that heuristic here. But we could just like ask an LLM about one bit of information for every possible pair. Maybe a local LLM or a smaller LLM. Another thing is like the whole stack here depends on language models from one provider. There are leaderboards online. What is done here is retrieval, so these similarities between vectors, and there are embedding models. This is changing, of course, every day, but there are embedding models that do significantly better in retrieval than the model used here. So maybe if there's an issue with false positive in the last step, maybe also using a stronger embedding model could be an additional help here. And then lastly, that's already been said by you as well in the presentation, is I was wondering if it could be possible to look at directed graphs. One approach would be to ask the LLM how important is a certain input in another input, like you were saying. I was also thinking maybe one could ask it to rank the outputs, or rank suggested goods in order of importance and so on. I agree that's pretty difficult to do, but it would be quite interesting because then you might see kind of what inputs are most crucial for other outputs. Yeah, great paper. Thanks very much.
Prashant, you want to respond directly? And then we're going to collect questions again.
Thank you very much. I think we consider lots of pros and cons and many of these suggestions in different ways. So let me start with weights. Weights are super interesting. They have lots of assumptions to them. So how do we set weights? Let's say if you want to make cheese, and you need some kind of cow or sheep, however you want your cheese. It's critical. Do we base it on how critical it is? Do we base it on what's the cost? I think milk from cow, like the cow itself, will not be as expensive as the capital input, such as milking machines. But the milking machine will be used to make many milk for many years, whereas that cow may die after some point. So do we base it on cost? Do we base it on how critical they are? As I said, some of these milking machines may have dual use, and they may be able to process perhaps sheep milk. Again, substitution, you may be able to completely eradicate cow and get sheep milk. So when we think of weights, we'll have to limit the potential of the model. And I think for most applications, people study very specific questions in economics. we tried to ask a very broad question for which we want to have a very broad understanding of input-output. If we were to localize it, if we were to give it weights, I don't think we would be able to understand onshoring. However, if people want to use it for certain applications, I think it is possible to ask for weights. You can ask for substitutes, complements, criticality. It will be hard to just get the answer in one go. There will be some assumptions and trade-offs. Another thing is localizing it. In India, cow, how you treat cow, you worship cow. So cow is beyond capital good. It's a holy good. You make gingerbread in India, you will add some, you will actually add lots of ginger to it because to make it more spicy. So ginger will be a high proportion of input. So the weights will completely change based on the context and also over time. So, which is why we did not go through this challenge of getting weights, given how many assumptions and how much it would vary. So discrete edges helps. In input-output tables, you have cost expenditure. I think it is a fair assumption, and perhaps this is something we can explore. The other thing is fine-tuning the model. If we give it more information, I think it will be very useful when we actually want to localize the network to a given context. If we fine-tune it by or do retrieval augmented generation, which is give it some additional information. It already has so much information, but we give some additional information to focus on, which is some context about the country and production processes in the country, or we fine-tune it based on some examples of how the production network in that country would look like. I think it will be very useful if we were to localize it, which I think we may want to for certain applications, or to add costs by giving examples of what costs structures would look like. But as an overall thing, we have tried already doing fine-tuning. We gave examples of production processes. We also did some retrieval augmented generation, and we realized that when we do that, even though the precision increases, recall goes down a lot, because to make cheese, you can make cheese with full-fat milk, semi-skimmed milk, and many types of milk. Because these HS codes are so granular that sometimes the model may end up picking only one of the given variants of that good. And it may vary a lot based on what the model at the moment thought was the cost structure, what would be useful in certain contexts, and perhaps it was influenced by US data a lot, because US produces a lot of data, so maybe it was influenced in that manner. So we did not want to bias the model in that way. We wanted it to decide for itself what is the best. Then using different cosine similarity thresholds, basically we did an exercise internally, and we realized that if we do this false positive filter that we do at the end, we ask at the input and output level whether or not, once we get the production network, is this production network good or bad? Like, is this true or false? And it was highly correlated with increasing cosine similarity thresholds. It was highly correlated with edge overlap. So edge overlap means if we ask the prompt 20 times and we get that link 15 out of 20 times, then the edge overlap is 75%. So how many times the same product appears? It could be that cow will always appear as an input to milk, but sheep may appear 2 out of 20 times, because sheep, even though it is a potential input, it's just not as popular to make cheese. Depends, again, on the country. Some people may eat more sheep milk. No one does in India. Yeah, so I think that's just, because we are asking such a broad question, we tried to keep things slightly more broad and not fine-tune and localize it with weights. But I think we will try to do so in future projects where we do some specific applications.
Okay, thank you so much. First of all, you noticed the helicopters, the byproduct probably of Joe Biden's visit in Berlin. I hope the sound was still okay and was not too loud in the background. Then we will open the floor for questions, if there are any at the moment. Yes, I see 2 people on the left side. Maybe just start from...
Okay. Hi, Jan Schimmick from Mannheim. So it's a very, very interesting project. I have two questions. One is an econ one is a more geeky one. So the econ one, I understand the reasons why you want to sort of shy away a bit on these weights, but I think ultimately, as an economist, I would want to know, when you measure these linkages, is that like a direct input or like a high total requirement input? So in some sense, I think it would be good to know what a link, even if it's created by this AI, actually is. So is it like something above a certain threshold of total requirements, or is it just like a direct input into the milk example? And the geeky question is about the thing you mentioned about the hallucination. So I was wondering, I mean, you say you essentially, if I understood it correctly, you answered the same question like 20 times. So why don't you just set this temperature parameter to 0 to make the model deterministic and also have something that is like replicable for future research, that you can essentially ask the same question with the identical prompt and you would always get the same answer? So that maybe I misunderstood it, but that would be the geeky part that I would be interested in. Thanks.
Yeah, so on the geeky part to start with, temperature of 0 means you have infinite iterations basically, because you just ask it once and it will give you the same response many times. But the problem also happens is that we also limit the potential of the model. We harm the model when we do so. So we did an exercise where we varied temperatures from 0 to 1 in steps of 10. And we saw that, and we then correlated the network with input-output tables and with other measures. And we saw something around 0.4 to 0.8 range had the best correlation. 0, so as it went down to 0.1, it went down a lot. But as it went to 0, it went completely down in its performance. There is some loss, even though it is deterministic. The value of large language model, the probabilistic nature has some value, and it is, I think, beyond my understanding why. So if we increase the temperature a lot, but we asked many times, and we set a threshold, it is very close to it being, it's closer to it being deterministic, even though we are using potential of a very probabilistic model. And in terms of direct input or not, we do ask for linkage types. We do not study it at the moment, but you can ask if the input is a raw material, is it an intermediate good or capital good? That gives us some qualitative indication. Again, it does not tell us that this is a very critical component and without it you can't do anything, but I think it is possible, like at the edge level. We can ask, once we get the inputs, all the potential inputs, we can ask, is this input very critical? Is this input like substitutable, and what is it substitutable with? So these are some extensions that people can add as well. We will keep our methodology very transparent and the data, and I think people may want to adapt it according to their usage. We will also try to do so, but we'll try to make it very easily, flexibly adaptable for people's usage. Yeah, thank you.
I think there were more questions on the left side. Just go ahead.
Yes. Thiemo Bofis from MCC in Berlin. So I worked quite a bit in the input-output community, in the industrial ecology community, and that's an important question that you are trying to answer here, and that's a joint preoccupation of many input-output practitioners to come to product-level details. I'm a bit surprised that you didn't mention life cycle analysis databases. So you have these databases like EcoInvent, for instance, so they are made from industrial ecology studies where they really look into, so they go to the factories and they really look at the inputs for producing a specific good. And that's a fantastic data source, I think, and that might probably give better, so if you train an AI model on that, you can probably get much more specific results than a general large language model. So did you think about that, or?
Is this very specific, industry specific, or is it for all 5,000 products that you know all the inputs?
So I think the way these databases are constructed, so you have specific, you have a whole field of industrial ecology already doing this sort of analysis on specific supply chains, and then you have databases aggregating everything. So I don't think that's comprehensive, but for sure you have a lot of sectors and industry that are covered. And I mean, that brings me to a follow-up question, which is, there's a trade-off between usually having like super precise data for a limited scope, so essentially either you use a life cycle analysis approach to go very specifically in the context-specific case of an industry, or usually you would use, on the other side, input-output tables when you want to answer more general questions. And it seems that you are trying to like chase both directions at the same time. And I have some concerns that, I mean, you cannot, I mean, the AI cannot resolve by itself this trade-off, right? There are these context-specific questions that you mentioned earlier, etc. So I just wanted to point maybe that
yeah, I can spell that trade-off a little bit more. So the problem and the measurement challenge here is there are experts who are experts in their own areas. We would want 5,000 experts, or let's say 1,000 experts or so. And then experts will have different levels of expertise in their areas, and they will vary by context and time. And if we were to have the same expert, say, holding constant every other thing, every expert was similar, although those 1,000 were similar, and they would tell us this is an input to this thing. This is very hard to imagine happening. There will be lots of variations on experts' knowledge, but they are very useful. If we are able to access all these experts in different fields, this will be a great validation for our input-output linkages. So this is on our agenda to validate, even if it's portions of data. And I think some of these data sets that you're mentioning, or this broader project you're mentioning, is going to be very useful. We'll try to further do some human validations, expert human validations. We did some non-expert human validations, and there was lots of disagreement between humans. So us 4 co-authors, we had lots of of course, like, if you are specializing in cheese industry, you would not know that much about some random chemical that you can't pronounce. So humans, we do need experts, but then experts' knowledge vary across industries, and the level of expertise varies. So that's, whereas the LLM, we know what we are asking, and of course, it is black boxy, but there is a systematic process we are using to ask, and we are asking it many times, and then we are also filtering it out. So hopefully this adds.
Sorry, Prashant, we're running out of time a little bit. So my suggestion would be, if there's more econ theory or econ question, a quick one, then we can ask it now. And otherwise, I would ask you guys to meet in the next break and discuss the technical or geeky stuff together. So, a short question maybe. Otherwise, we will stop here. So thanks so much to the presenter and also the discussant. We'll have a 10-minute break, and then we'll start our last session. Thanks.